Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karis Templeman. I'm a research fellow here at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and I'm the manager of the project on Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific region. And it's my distinct pleasure today to introduce our distinguished guest and friend, Scott Kastner, coming to us live from the East Coast, University of Maryland. I'm really delighted to have Scott with us today to talk about his new book on a topic that's near and dear to my own heart, War and Peace in the Taiwan Strait. I hope available at a library or bookstore near you, or if not, on Amazon or from Princeton University Press. Is that right, Scott? Columbia University Press, my mistake. Unlike a lot of newly minted experts in this area, Scott actually has long experience thinking about the issue of a possible conflict over Taiwan between the United States and China. He's a relative rarity in that he's spent most of his career thinking about this issue. And he has, in my view, written a really careful, thorough, thoughtful, and dare I say, elegant book on the prospects for conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And so I'm delighted to have him here with us today. He also, I should note, is a professor in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, College Park. He graduated from Cornell University for his undergrad, and he has a PhD from UCSD down in San Diego. In addition to this new book, he has a couple other books, Political Conflict and Economic Interdependence Across the Taiwan Strait and Beyond, and China's Strategic Multilateralism, Investing in Global Governance, with Margaret Pearson and Chad Rector. And so today, we're going to hear about war and peace in the Taiwan Strait. Scott, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Karis. I really appreciate the opportunity to give the talk today. I was supposed to come out in the spring to give a talk, but I had this kind of horrible bout of food poisoning. And so I'm glad I have the chance to do the talk today online. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so as Karis noted, I'm going to talk a little bit about a new book of mine, War and Peace in the Taiwan Strait, which kind of came out at the end of last year, and which tries to kind of think a little bit about prospects for cross-strait conflict, how a conflict could occur, and a little bit about kind of what might be done to avoid a conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So it wasn't that long ago when the cross-strait relationship actually didn't seem that bad, right? So during the presidency of Ma Ying-jeou, who was Taiwan's president from 2008 to 2016, we actually saw a period of unprecedented detente in the Taiwan Strait. Under Ma's presidency, we saw a huge amount of dialogue between Taiwan and the PRC. We saw a raft of agreements reached between the two sides, including a number of economic agreements that largely normalized the bilateral relationship, the opening up of direct travel across the Taiwan Strait, and increasingly kind of higher level meetings culminating in this kind of unprecedented meeting between Ma and Chinese President Xi Jinping in Singapore in 2015. Okay, and so it wasn't that long ago then that this kind of issue had really, to some degree, kind of drifted to the back burner in places like Washington, where attention was kind of focused on other more pressing potential flashpoints for conflict, places like North Korea, Iran, and so forth. Okay, so this all changed pretty dramatically in 2016 with the election of Tsai Ing-wen as Taiwan's president in a landslide. So although Tsai is, and I think quite rightly seen as being quite pragmatic and moderate in her approach to the cross-strait relationship, one thing that she has not done that her predecessor Ma did was has been to recognize or accept a one China principle. This idea that in principle, at least, Taiwan should be thought of as a part of China. And dating back to the 1990s, the PRC has made this a precondition for talks between Taiwan and the PRC, basically arguing that if Taiwan's not willing to kind of accept this idea that it's part of China in principle, then there's really nothing to talk about. Given kind of her unwillingness to kind of accept this principle and her party's unwillingness to do so, the unprecedented dialogue that we saw during the Ma administration kind of came to a screeching halt in 2016. And since then, the PRC has kind of steadily ratcheted up coercive pressure directed at Taiwan. And this pressure is kind of manifested in a number of different forms. We've seen it, some economic coercion directed against Taiwan. We've seen a lot of kind of diplomatic coercion directed against Taiwan, where, for instance, a number of Taiwan's diplomatic allies, countries that still have kind of recognized the Republic of China government, have switched recognition to Beijing. And most notably, we've seen kind of a large increase in military coercion directed against Taiwan. And this coercion has taken a number of forms. We've seen kind of a number of kind of large-scale military exercises, especially, for instance, in the aftermath of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last year. The PRC kind of frequently circumnavigates the island of Taiwan with military aircraft, enters Taiwan's self-declared air defense identification zone, and pretty recently has begun frequently crossing the midline of the Taiwan Strait with military aircraft, something that in the past it had largely refrained from doing. So with this kind of large and very kind of visible increase in military coercion directed against Taiwan in recent years, we've seen kind of a growing concern kind of about kind of the risks of military conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And it's a kind of a widely kind of held concern. So there's a kind of a cover of The Economist magazine from a couple of years ago, which I think somewhat hyperbolically, but that nonetheless kind of poignantly kind of suggests that Taiwan is the most dangerous place on earth these days. And this was kind of before the war in Ukraine, right, which even kind of further heightened kind of anxiety about the possibility of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And we've also seen a number of kind of high-ranking U.S. officials kind of raise the prospect of conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So Philip Davidson, who at the time was the commander of U.S. Indo-PACOM in 2021, kind of testimony to Congress suggested that PRC use of force to achieve unification is something that's manifest during this decade, in fact, in the next 6 years. And we've seen other high-profile U.S. officials kind of make similar or issue similar warnings. At the same time, I think it's important to note that that there's not a consensus on this issue of kind of how likely conflict is in the Taiwan Strait. And many analysts kind of argue that a cross-strait conflict is not something that's inevitable. And so here I'm putting up a headline from an op-ed of a couple of years ago by three very prominent experts on the Taiwan issue, basically kind of arguing against hyping the risk of conflict over Taiwan. Okay, so it's this kind of big question that I try to get at in the book manuscript. How worried should we be about the possibility of armed conflict in the Taiwan Strait? And I suggest that part of the reason why we see these very differing assessments among very well-informed kind of experts on the Taiwan, on kind of the risk of war in the Taiwan Strait, is because it's an enormously difficult task to assess how likely conflict is in this case, in part because cross-strait relations are characterized by a number of complex trends that have both complicated and at times contradictory effects on the potential for cross-strait stability. And so, for instance, right, there are a number of trends that kind of suggest reasons to be quite pessimistic about the risk of conflict in the Taiwan Strait, right? So clearly in recent decades, the military balance of power has shifted quite dramatically in the Taiwan Strait and between kind of the US and China more broadly. Here I've put up just a kind of a simple chart that kind of captures one metric of the shifting balance of power, military spending in the PRC versus Taiwan. And obviously, even as kind of military spending has been relatively stagnant in Taiwan, it's grown exponentially over the past couple of decades and a few decades in the PRC, right? And so this kind of rapid shift in the military balance of power is something that's potentially quite troubling, given that the PRC claims Taiwan is rightfully part of Chinese territory. It potentially suggests that the use of military coercion is something that's increasingly seen as feasible by the PRC. Okay. Likewise, we've seen kind of trends in Taiwan that potentially give reason to be concerned about the risk for conflict in the Taiwan Strait. In particular, we've seen in recent decades kind of a movement away in Taiwan society from kind of this idea that kind of people identify as being Chinese. And if you'll just excuse me for a second, I'm feeling a little bit lightheaded, so I'm just going to sit down here. Sorry. Okay. So we've seen kind of pretty rapid societal shifts in Taiwan, right? Where if you kind of go back a few decades ago, and you ask kind of people, do you consider yourself Chinese, Taiwanese, or both Chinese and Taiwanese? A majority of respondents replied either that they thought of themselves as Chinese or as both Chinese and Taiwanese, right? But you kind of fast forward a few decades, and over the past 15 years or so, a clear majority of respondents to these sorts of surveys self-identify as solely Taiwanese, right? And so if you're looking at this from China's perspective, it suggests the possibility of a Taiwan that's kind of slipping away from China's grasp, a Taiwan that no longer even really thinks of itself as being Chinese. There are also kind of some signs that China, especially under Xi Jinping, is becoming somewhat less patient on the issue of Taiwan. Right, so Xi Jinping has clearly indicated that he views unification with Taiwan as an important national priority, as have former leaders. But Xi has kind of at times said things that are in particular kind of suggest that he might be especially impatient on the issue. So he has a couple of times kind of indicated this is not an issue that should be passed on to future generations and so forth, right? And again, this gives reason to be potentially pessimistic about the risk for conflict in the Taiwan Strait to the degree that you have a PRC that's kind of impatient about making progress on unification. And there's some evidence of broader public opinion in the PRC that's actually fairly hawkish. And so here I'm just kind of putting up an article by Jessica Chen Weiss, a well-known expert on Chinese politics and foreign policy, who undertook a study of a survey of Chinese public opinion and found some evidence of kind of growing hawkishness among the Chinese public. Okay, and so there are a number of reasons to be kind of concerned, right, about the kind of the risk of military conflict in the Taiwan Strait. Okay, but at the same time, there are other kind of stabilizing factors. Okay, and so one factor that is especially, I think, important to highlight is the extensive economic linkages across the Taiwan Strait and between China and the global economy. And so here I've just kind of put up a chart that just shows the degree to which China and Taiwan kind of rapidly became economically integrated during the 2008 aughts in particular. China is by far Taiwan's largest trading partner today. The vast majority of Taiwan's outward foreign direct investment is in China. And there's evidence that China also depends quite heavily on this relationship, especially given Taiwan's importance as a manufacturer of high-end semiconductors. Okay, and so you might expect that this is a reason to kind of be a little bit more optimistic about the prospects for conflict, in that it suggests that if a conflict were to occur, it would be quite costly for all parties. And even though there are kind of some trends in Taiwan politics and society that undoubtedly concern the PRC greatly, the growth in Taiwan-centric identity, the fact that the DPP has done quite well in recent presidential elections. There are other things that we might expect kind of give the PRC more reason to be at least somewhat patient, right? And I think foremost among these is that there's still a lot of pragmatism in Taiwan public opinion on sovereignty issues. And so here I've put up a kind of a running poll that's kind of, a survey that's kind of conducted over time by the same outfit as the previous one that I put up, which basically asks individuals kind of their views on final sovereignty issues, giving people a range of options from immediate independence to immediate unification and a number of kind of intermediate status quo options. And what's interesting about the findings, the kind of consistent findings from this poll over time is that a majority of respondents typically not only support the status quo, but don't even kind of indicate a preference on final status issues. They indicate either that they support the status quo indefinitely, or they want to maintain the status quo indefinitely, or that they want to maintain the status quo for now and make a decision on final status issues at a later date. Okay, and so this indicates that there's a lot of pragmatism in Taiwan public opinion on sovereignty issues. And other polls kind of suggest that most Taiwanese are opposed to dramatic steps that could provoke China because they don't want to see a military conflict in the Taiwan Strait. Okay, so my hope in writing this book was to kind of start to think about how we can think about how these different trends might fit together, and to think a little bit about kind of what are some of the underlying processes that could give rise to a conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And I'll just kind of note that I don't reach kind of strong kind of headline kind of conclusions about the actual likelihood of conflict, right? So I'm pretty neutral on this issue about kind of how likely a conflict is. It's something that I think is a real possibility, but it's also, I'm kind of on the side that views it as something that's not inevitable. The purpose in the book is to more kind of think about what are the kind of underlying causal processes that could give rise to conflict. Okay, and so the approach that I kind of take in the book is it's largely a rationalist approach, and I'll just note that I kind of begin by emphasizing that both China and Taiwan have a mix of status quo and revisionist preferences relating to Taiwan and Taiwan's status. Okay, so China, on the one hand, has very much kind of a status quo goal of wanting to kind of stop Taiwan independence and to stop kind of movement in the direction of independence. But China also wants unification with Taiwan, right? And so you could kind of see like this kind of status quo goal of stopping Taiwan independence, right? And often the PRC kind of frames its rhetoric, especially when kind of threatening military force against Taiwan, as kind of pursuing a status quo goal of stopping Taiwan independence. Okay, but clearly the PRC has this kind of longer term, highly revisionist goal of achieving national unification with Taiwan. And Taiwan, for its part, has its own kind of status quo goal of kind of avoiding being coerced into unification. Okay, but across the political spectrum, there's a pretty broad consensus that Taiwan should have more international space than it's now afforded. And many within Taiwan want to see formal independence if that outcome were possible. And polls kind of suggest that upwards of 70% of respondents typically say that they would support independence if it could be achieved peacefully. Okay, so both sides, you kind of have this kind of mix of status quo and revisionist preferences. And in turn, you can kind of envision two kind of broad pathways to conflict, where each side is kind of pursuing its revisionist preferences, running up against kind of the status quo preferences of the other side, right? So you can imagine a pathway to conflict that involves Taiwanese revisionism rooted in actual or potential efforts by Taiwan to formalize its independence or kind of effectively to preclude unification as a viable future scenario. And you can imagine a pathway to conflict that involves Chinese revisionism of kind of efforts by the PRC to realize its own highly revisionist goal of formal unification. Okay, so in the book, I kind of develop a kind of a simple and pretty kind of stylized model of the cross-strait relationship that kind of draws from kind of some of the models that you see in kind of some of the rationalist conflict literature. And here I kind of conceptualize the cross-strait relationship as as kind of bargaining over Taiwanese sovereignty. And I kind of think of Taiwanese sovereignty as residing on a continuum that ranges from formal unification with the PRC on one end and formal Taiwan independence on the other end. You could kind of think of China's ideal outcome, of course, as lying kind of on the unification end of the continuum. And for simplicity, I think of Taiwan's ideal outcome as lying toward the independence end of the continuum, although recognizing that this is also contested within Taiwan. Okay, and I kind of think of the status quo as lying somewhere in between these kind of two extremes, right? So Taiwan currently enjoys kind of de facto independence and autonomy, but it kind of lacks kind of formal, internationally recognized legal independence. Okay, and I kind of think of, in the model, I kind of imagine that if the two sides were to fight a war, that this would result in kind of some new outcome with regard to Taiwan's status. And here, for simplicity, I've just kind of arbitrarily placed the war outcome kind of to the left of the status quo, closer to the unification end of the continuum. And so you could think of the war outcome in two ways. You could think of it as kind of, if the two sides were to fight a war, this would be kind of the bargain that they would reach to end fighting, right? Which would result in kind of some new understanding about Taiwan's status. Or you could think of it more probabilistically as kind of the likelihood that the PRC prevails in a conflict, and the higher that likelihood, and gets to kind of impose its preferred outcome of unification, right? And so the higher that likelihood, the closer W would lie to the unification end of the continuum. Okay, and then of course, drawing from bargaining theory and international conflict, I make the assumption that war would be costly for both sides. I don't think it's necessary to kind of outline how horrific the costs of a major military conflict in the Taiwan Strait would be. But needless to say, those costs would detract from the utility that each side kind of derives from the war outcome. And once you take into those costs into account, Taiwan's war utility lies not at point W, but kind of further away from its ideal point of independence at a point that I've labeled here as point T. And China's war utility lies further from its ideal point of unification at a point that I've labeled here as point R. And the reason I labeled that as kind of point R is you could basically think of this as China's red line or its reversion point. Right. And so as long as the status quo resides to the left of point R in this kind of stylistic model, then China prefers to kind of accept or live with that status quo rather than initiating military conflict. And I think kind of realistically that if there were to be a war, it would be China that would be initiating that conflict. Okay, so then I have a couple of chapters in the book. Then in the context of this model, try to kind of think about how a war could arise, either as a kind of a consequence broadly of revisionist behavior by Taiwan versus revisionist behavior by the PRC. Okay, and so when thinking about kind of a war rooted in Taiwan revisionism, one kind of potentially obvious possibility is you could imagine a relatively revisionist Taiwan government pushing the envelope on sovereignty-related issues, right? Seeking to improve Taiwan's international status and so forth, in a way that basically crosses the PRC's reversion point or its red line, thereby potentially triggering a military response, right? And if we kind of go back to the 90s and the 2000 aughts, many analysts of the cross-strait relationship thought of this as the most realistic kind of scenario for how a cross-strait military conflict would arise. Right. And they had a number of kind of things in mind for kind of what Taiwan could be doing that would provoke a conflict from the PRC. Right. So they kind of highlighted things like efforts by Taiwan to raise Taiwan's international profile. Right. And so this was especially notable during the Lee Teng-hui era, where there's kind of an effort to kind of pursue what he termed pragmatic diplomacy to kind of increase Taiwan's international visibility. Noted most, or the kind of the apogee of kind of this effort was a visit to his alma mater at Cornell University in 1995, which led to a prolonged crisis in the cross-strait relationship. You could also kind of look at kind of the way that Taiwan's presidents have described the nature of Taiwan's sovereign status and its relationship to the PRC, right? And so Lee, late in his time in office, kind of described the cross-strait relationship as being a state-to-state relationship, or at least a special state-to-state relationship, kind of implying that he thought of Taiwan as being kind of a sovereign, independent equal to the PRC. His successor, Chen Shui-bian of the Democratic Progressive Party, arguably went further in kind of arguing that each side of the Taiwan Strait is a separate country, without kind of qualifying it like Lee did. Well, at least, it's a special state-to-state relationship, right? Chen didn't have that kind of qualifier. And even Taiwan's current president, Tsai Ing-wen, has kind of highlighted Taiwan's functional independence from the PRC, right? So she's kind of indicated that Taiwan should be thought of as an independent country already, that calls itself the Republic of China, Taiwan. Okay, and also you could kind of point to, especially during the Chen Shui-bian administration, efforts to, if you will, de-Sinify Taiwan, or kind of highlight Taiwan's otherness from China, its Taiwanese-ness rather than its Chinese-ness. And this took a number of forms during the Chen Shui-bian administration. Efforts to rename entities in Taiwan, as Taiwan rather than as China. Efforts to downplay the legacy of Chiang Kai-shek, right, who of course kind of viewed national unification as kind of a core goal of his. And here I have kind of put a picture of kind of what the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall looked like in the waning days of the Chen Shui-bian presidency, where, right, the honor guard was removed, the lights were turned off, kites were hung from the ceilings, and so he's, Chiang is kind of sitting there in the darkness, kind of obscured from people who came into the hall, who saw instead kind of large placards with pictures of Taiwan's democracy movement. And the name was Taiwan was added in English to the ROC passport during this time, and so forth, right? And so again, you could kind of see this as an effort to kind of move Taiwan on this kind of continuum of sovereignty toward the kind of the independence end of the continuum, right? And so one kind of scenario for conflict, again, kind of involves like a Taiwan government that's essentially kind of pushing the status quo toward the end of the independence end of the continuum, potentially crossing China's reversion point, or its red line, and triggering a military response. Ultimately, I think this is a problem that's kind of rooted in an information problem. The issue here is that it's hard for Taiwan to know exactly where PRC red lines lie. It's hard to know kind of how far Taiwan can push without triggering a military response. And it's hard for the PRC to communicate this information credibly without actually using military instruments. And so I think that ultimately, when people kind of talked about the risk of conflict in the 90s and 2000s, they really had in mind kind of an information problem, where it was, Taiwan was kind of pushing toward independence, but there was kind of uncertainty about what the PRC would ultimately tolerate. And no one really wanted to kind of trigger an actual war in the Taiwan Strait. Okay, I argue in the book, though, that several factors did combine at the time and have kind of continued to combine to mitigate the kind of the risk of this sort of a scenario. Okay, most importantly, I think, is that Taiwan's costs of conflict are getting unambiguously worse as a consequence both of the rapidly shifting military balance of power, but also because of deepening economic integration across the Taiwan Strait, right? This in turn, I believe, kind of makes Taiwan's leaders kind of inherently more cautious in kind of testing China's red lines, kind of testing what China will tolerate in terms of kind of independence. The risks of kind of going too far and triggering a military response have simply become too great. And I think that this is partly why we see kind of a more moderate Tsai presidency that's not quite as visible in her efforts to kind of highlight Taiwan's otherness from China as Chen Shui-bian was. But there are other factors as well. So I highlight in the book that China's actually been quite good at sending costly signals to kind of indicate that, even though it's a little bit vague about kind of the precise steps that Taiwan could take that might trigger a military response, the PRC has been pretty clear that there are certain things that Taiwan could do that would be too far, right? Things like renaming the country and so forth. And so the PRC has been pretty good at kind of signaling that, I think, pretty credibly, with kind of frequent displays of military force and so forth. And finally, I think it's important to note as well that Taiwan is functionally independent now, right? It has its own government, it has its own elections, it has its own military, right? It's autonomous. It's for all intents and purposes, it basically gets what most countries of the world get in terms of kind of sovereign status. Further gains on sovereignty issues then are mostly, not entirely, but mostly symbolic for Taiwan. Okay, and what that means in turn is that to the degree that Taiwan kind of pushes the envelope on sovereignty-related issues, it's essentially risking very concrete downside costs in the pursuit of mostly symbolic gains. And I think that this also kind of induces a level of caution in kind of pursuing those gains. Okay, so this is a scenario that I think was quite worrisome about 15, 20 years ago, but it's become less worrisome over time. I do know in the book that there is kind of a more insidious kind of version of kind of a red line conflict scenario that I kind of refer to it. One is that's kind of rooted in the potential for future Taiwan revisionism. And if you're familiar with kind of some of the literature on causes of war, right, this is kind of a more, I think, of a problem that resembles a credible commitment problem, and not an information problem like the scenario that I just described. Okay, and it's basically rooted in PRC fear that Taiwan might be kind of slipping away from China's grasp for good, right? And underlying this scenario are kind of fears in Beijing about a number of trends in Taiwan and especially Taiwan-US relations that the PRC fears kind of would, over time, kind of effectively preclude the possibility of unification with Taiwan. Okay, things like the shifting identity trends that I noted earlier that from the PRC's perspective, may be making Taiwan increasingly ungovernable from China's perspective, right? People don't even think of themselves as Chinese anymore, right? And deepening US-Taiwan security cooperation, which the PRC kind of worries could make it impossible to kind of coerce Taiwan toward unification. Okay, and I argue in the book that this kind of resembles a commitment problem because it's hard for Taiwan's leaders to credibly commit to alter some of these underlying trends, especially trends in Taiwan society, which they have limited direct control over, right? But also kind of, it's hard for them to tie their hands of kind of their successors when kind of thinking about US-Taiwan ties and so forth, right? And the risk then is that Beijing kind of concludes that it needs to act sooner rather than later to prevent Taiwan from becoming irretrievably not Chinese. Okay, but I argue that there are mitigating factors in the book, and I don't think we should kind of overly worry about this scenario. Okay, most important, there are other trends that give Beijing reason to be patient, right? And reason for optimism, including most obviously the shifting balance of military power. Okay, and furthermore, unless Beijing is very confident that not only would it prevail in a conflict, but that it would prevail and be able to kind of end this issue for good by occupying Taiwan, right? Any use of military force is probably only makes these commitment problems even worse because they're going to reinforce interest in Taiwan and seeking closer security ties with the US, and they're going to reinforce suspicion of the PRC in Taiwan. Okay, and so the only way to really resolve this problem is by actually occupying Taiwan militarily. And unless the PRC is confident it can do that, it can't be confident that it can resolve this issue. Okay, I also, how am I doing for time? So, okay, so I'll got about 5-10 more minutes. Okay. So in the book, I also kind of think a little bit about kind of the flip side then, and of kind of the risks of a conflict kind of rooted in PRC revisionism, or kind of efforts by Beijing to kind of achieve its own clearly revisionist goal of kind of formal unification with Taiwan. And of course, this is in recent years, this is what kind of gets all the attention when among analysts kind of thinking about a cross-strait conflict. Okay, and it's worth kind of beginning by noting that it's pretty clear, right, that that recent trends in the Taiwan Strait kind of suggest that Beijing's war utility is improving. I think that this isn't entirely certain, but it's likely, right? The shifting balance of military power is probably kind of increasing the PRC's confidence that it could prevail in a cross-strait, and it's probably reducing the PRC's kind of expected costs of conflict. And we could also kind of talk about things like economic integration, which kind of grew very rapidly during the 2000s, the 90s. But in recent years, it's grown much more slowly, and in fact has kind of leveled off kind of the amount of kind of economic integration that we see across the Taiwan Strait, right? And so there are reasons to think that the PRC's kind of expected utility for fighting a war is improving. Okay, and to the degree that that's the case, we would expect that China's red line is essentially shifting to the left in this kind of stylized model that I presented. And of course, if we kind of get to a world where, so in Taiwan revisionist scenarios, we're kind of worried about kind of a Taiwan government pushing the status quo to the right of point R. In this world, we're worried about kind of what happens if R shifts to the left of the status quo. Okay, and clearly, if we get to that kind of a world, the PRC would get a better utility by initiating military conflict than kind of accepting a continuation of the status quo. Okay, of course, Taiwan is a strategic actor, right? And once R does shift to the left of the status quo, if we come to that point, then Taiwan has incentives to accommodate this, right? Because war would obviously be a horrific outcome for Taiwan, right? And so to the degree that that kind of the PRC's war utility is improving to such a degree that it prefers war over the status quo, we would expect that Taiwan would have incentives to accommodate that reality. And basically, if we kind of go back to this chart, to kind of push the status quo toward the unification end of the continuum, right? By perhaps accepting a one China principle, right? And so forth. Okay, and in fact, right, people like John Mearsheimer, most famously, I think, kind of have argued that this is exactly what we're likely to see happen, right? So about 10 years ago, Mearsheimer kind of very provocatively kind of published this article in the National Interest, Say Goodbye to Taiwan, where he was basically saying that Taiwan is doomed, right? And the reason it's doomed is because of the rapidly shifting balance of military power in the Taiwan Strait. And over time, the best that Taiwan could hope for is to accommodate this reality. And so it should begin kind of getting used to the fact that it's going to just have to accept that it's going to increasingly have to accommodate the shifting balance of military power in the Taiwan Strait. In the book that I wrote, I'm kind of skeptical that this would actually happen this way. Right. And in fact, I think it's actually relatively unlikely that if we get to a world where the status quo or that China's kind of war utility kind of shifts so much that it believes that it would get a better outcome from fighting a war than kind of accepting a continuation of the status quo. I think it's very unlikely in that kind of world that Taiwan would kind of accommodate this new reality. And there are a number of reasons for this. There are kind of information-related reasons, right? It would be really hard for the PRC to credibly signal that its red line has actually shifted to the point where it would prefer war, right? Why would it be hard to credibly signal this? Because China's kind of accepted Taiwan's separateness from China for decades now, right? And so it'd be very hard to kind of credibly say or make the claim that the PRC is now willing to use military force, whereas kind of in the past it wasn't. Okay, but even if it's able to kind of overcome this kind of basic problem, there are a number of other kind of hurdles having to do with things like domestic politics in Taiwan, right, where there's very little support in Taiwan for accommodation on sovereignty issues. And so it would be very, very difficult politically for a leader to kind of move in the direction of even kind of hinting at accepting one country, two systems, for instance, which is very unpopular in Taiwan. There are psychological reasons, okay, kind of the last bullet point here, where there's kind of a wide understanding in Taiwan, right? However you want to call the name of the country, whether it's Taiwan or the Republic of China, there's a widely held belief among Taiwan citizens that Taiwan is now a sovereign country, right? And people tend to be resistant to kind of giving up things that they already believe that they have, right? And so this would very much kind of involve kind of moving into kind of a domain of losses, if you will, for Taiwan. And so there are reasons to kind of expect risk acceptant behavior if we get into a world where even Taiwan kind of believes that the PRC is kind of making credible threats of military force. And finally, credible commitment problems are likely to loom really large here. And the problem here is that to the degree that Taiwan kind of concedes ground on sovereignty-related issues, it's likely to erode its kind of future bargaining power, right? And I think this is most obvious when we kind of think about U.S.-Taiwan security ties, right? And so to the degree that Taiwan appears to be accommodating the PRC, I think it's reasonable to expect that Washington is going to be less willing to kind of signal strong support for Taiwan. And we've seen this in the past, right? So during the Ma administration, when we had, some accommodation in kind of a time where kind of the risk of conflict was lower, U.S.-China relations were better than they are today by a long shot. You still had kind of some concern in Washington over what Ma was doing, right? So one of the co-chairs of the Taiwan caucus in the U.S. House, for instance, basically signaled that he was going to quit because, if Ma was giving up, why should the U.S. continue to pursue this issue, right? And so I think that there's reasons that Taiwan would have, would be very hesitant about appearing to be kind of accommodating the PRC because of concerns about what that would mean in terms of kind of U.S. support for Taiwan. Okay, and so I think if we get into a world where the PRC believes that it gets a better utility from starting a war than accepting the status quo, it would be very, very difficult to avoid war in that sort of a scenario, right? And so I'll just kind of conclude that the key is to avoid kind of getting into that scenario or that kind of a situation in the first place, right? And that's kind of how I conclude the book. I don't have great ideas in this regard. I think clearly it's important that the U.S. maintain a strong deterrent posture in the region, while also making sure that the PRC views the status quo as something that is tolerable, right? And so what does that mean? It means not going overboard and kind of suggesting that U.S. ties to Taiwan are unconditional, right? Not kind of causing the PRC to kind of lose hope about kind of the feasibility of long-term unification, right? Okay, and then more generally, the worse the U.S.-China relationship is as a whole, arguably the less of a stake the PRC has in a stable status quo in the Taiwan Strait, right? And so I think that there's something to be said when thinking about kind of prospects for conflict in the Taiwan Strait, right? There's something to be said for at least trying to maintain some semblance of stability in the broader U.S.-China relationship. Okay, so I'll stop there. I've probably talked for too long already. I'll stop my screen share. I welcome any questions that people might have.
Yeah, no, that was great, Scott, and right on time. Thanks. I'd just like to invite our online audience. If you do have a question, you can go ahead and type it into the Q&A box. I've got a couple in the queue already. And we'll try to keep this very conversational. I have read most of the book, and so I have a couple questions I want to start out with here, and then we can transition over to the audience questions. But the first one is just kind of a big picture question about the U.S. Role in this relationship, and in particular, timelines. So there's a debate right now in the Taiwan Watchers community about whether time is on the side of the United States or of China in this relationship. And you can make an argument both ways. You can argue that the United States actually looks like we're suffering from some significant political dysfunction, relative decline, rising debt loads. We're more isolationist and divided than we were before. And in Beijing, watching these trends, they should just be patient because that will work in their favor over the long run. On the flip side, there's also an argument about peak China, and that we're at peak China, and China's demographic problems and its struggles to move over to a more consumption-driven economic model are likely to drag it down in the future, and it will have fewer and fewer resources to invest in a world-class military than it does today. So can you help us think through, using your model, what the trends or the timelines in these two big powers suggest for the likelihood of conflict across the strait?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, Cars. And so my view is that as I kind of try to hint right at in the talk, right? So long-term trends on these kind of issues are ambiguous, right? And so I think you're right? So there is a debate, and I don't know what the I don't really have a strong view on kind of like net analysis, right? Our long-term trends, right? If we kind of look at 2040 or whatever, right? Is it going to be more or less favorable from a US standpoint, or a Taiwan standpoint, when kind of thinking about like all the different things that kind of could affect kind of the prospects for an actual military conflict in the Taiwan Strait, right? So I think you're right that, so there are kind of these peak China arguments. I'm a little bit I think that they get a little bit oversold. I do think that there are big downside risks in China. The biggest probably being kind of the political side of the equation, and Xi Jinping's kind of management of the country. But it's not clear that that's going to have kind of catastrophic implications for China's kind of military development kind of over the long term. And there's something to be said that kind of a China that's kind of stagnating, right, economically, potentially poses kind of greater challenges to the US, right, in a lot of ways, right? It may be less constrained by kind of a concern about kind of implications of conflict for its ties to global markets and so forth, right? So I think it's really hard to kind of say, over the long term, whether kind of we're in a kind of a peak China situation where, over the long term kind of trends kind of favor the United States, or whether over the long term kind of trends are going to continue to favor China. And I agree, like the US poses, has its own kind of huge problems that it faces. And if I were China, I would probably kind of at least kind of sit around and see what happens in the next presidential election, and before kind of making any kind of firm decisions about this.
Okay.
That's a non-answer to your question. So I don't have a strong view on that.
Okay. Well, let me pose it another way and ask, there's this argument that there may be a closing window of PLA opportunity where the military balance in the Western Pacific has shifted clearly in China's favor, but it may not be in China's favor for that much longer as new things come online in the US's own kind of military capabilities. So does that argument sound plausible to you, or is it relevant to your analysis here?
Yeah, no, it's plausible, and it's one that I think merits concern, right? Like, so if it's true that Chinese leaders do perceive a closing window of opportunity, right, and so they kind of see they both see kind of a world where a window is going to open, right, where like what I've kind of described as, right, the China's reversion point kind of shifting to the left of the status quo, right, where there's kind of a belief that a military option would be better than accepting kind of a continuation of Taiwan separation from China, right? But there's a belief that this is kind of a temporary phenomenon, right? And it's not like the military option is going to keep getting better and better, but that's going to kind of, it's going to again kind of shift back over the status quo, right? That incentivizes kind of acting sooner rather than later, right? And not being patient. And so yes, it's something like, I think it is there is something to that logic. I think ultimately it's an empirical question that, like, I don't have the military expertise to have a strong position, right, on whether this is actually going to happen, right? But if it were to happen, it would be bad.
Yes, I agree with you there. So let's talk a little bit more about the U.S. kind of. So that you theorized the Taipei and the Beijing parts of the strategic triangle quite a bit in the book. The U.S. part is a little bit less theorized or developed, and so a couple of the big issues that I often encounter in this area. One is whether the U.S. should move to strategic clarity to kind of increase the credibility of its threat to intervene if China goes after Taiwan. And a second and broader question is about whether U.S. commitments, the credibility of U.S. commitments around the world are in some sense, signals of the credibility of the US commitment to Taiwan as well. So you hear specifically the Chinese are closely watching what the United States does in Ukraine, right? And if we don't support Ukraine, the Chinese will see that as a sign of weakness and come after Taiwan. Or the US pullout from Afghanistan should make the people in Taipei very nervous right now. I've specifically seen those quotes from people.
Yes.
And so how do you think about US credibility in this environment?
Yeah. Okay. Again, those are great questions. So let me start with the ambiguity, the strategic ambiguity kind of piece of this. So this has definitely gotten a lot of attention, right? This debate about, right? So the U.S. Commitment to Taiwan, it's clearly ambiguous, right? Like the U.S. Has kind of indicated that it has an interest in Taiwan security, but it's left, a lot of wiggle room in terms of kind of how it would actually respond to a conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So my view is that this is it's a little bit of a misplaced debate, right? For a couple of reasons. So one reason is that my understanding is that the PRC is largely kind of assuming that the U.S. is going to intervene, right? And so it's probably right, like the PRC is most likely paying much more attention to things like, could the U.S. effectively intervene, rather than kind of what are officials in Washington saying about this? Okay, that's kind of point number one. Point number two is that, like, I don't think that kind of saying that the U.S. has, saying verbally, which incidentally Biden's already done like 4 times, right? Saying that the U.S. will defend Taiwan if it's attacked, right? Does that dramatically increase kind of the credibility of U.S. commitments somehow? I don't think so, right? For a couple of reasons, right? Most obviously, like there's leadership turnover in the United States, right? And Trump, for instance, has there's evidence that he doesn't really care that much about Taiwan, i.e., like the Bolton memoir, right, and so forth, right? And so I think it's really, really hard for kind of any official in the U.S. right now to kind of credibly kind of make a statement, right, that is going to kind of tie the hands of successor administrations. And you see this even like existing formal defense agreements that the U.S. have, right, are potentially in question if Trump were to come into office again, right? And so I think that there's like limited value, like there's maybe some value, but it's not like, let's not overstate how much is actually going to kind of shift kind of views about what the U.S. is likely to do a few years down the road in the context of a Taiwan conflict. With regard to kind of this issue of like U.S. kind of reputation and kind of what the U.S. does elsewhere in the world kind of affects kind of perceptions about what the U.S. is going to do in Taiwan. Again, I suspect that that's overstated. Again, I'm largely kind of suspecting this. Now, not that you don't have inference. China has at times kind of drawn inference about the U.S., right? Like, and so, way back in the day, like in the 90s, there were writings in China that, oh, the U.S. is casualty averse because look at Somalia, right? And kind of the quick, kind of pulling out of Somalia and so forth. So it's not like no one draws any inference based on kind of what countries do in other contexts. But I also think that, you don't want to kind of overstate the degree to which there's like really strong inference, right, that somehow the Taiwan situation is analogous to Ukraine or especially to Afghanistan, right? First of all, it would be easier for the U.S. to kind of intervene directly in a Taiwan contingency, but also there's reasons to kind of think that the U.S. kind of views Taiwan as important in different ways than, say, Ukraine, right? It has a much longer standing kind of though now informal, technically, a much longer kind of security relationship with Taiwan, including a past formal alliance agreement that lasted until the U.S. switched diplomatic ties and so forth. So I wouldn't kind of overstate the degree to which kind of inference can be drawn based on what the U.S. is doing in other places.
Okay, Great. One more question, and then I'll turn over to the audience. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the implications of public versus private behavior and signaling, especially in the U.S. Taiwan relationship. So the things that really seem to provoke a strong response from Beijing in the U.S. Taiwan relationship are high-profile public things. So you noted Lee Deng-hui's visit to Cornell in 1995. More recently, we had the Pelosi visit to Taiwan, and Beijing signaled very early on they were going to respond in a very dramatic way to that event. But there's lots of stuff that we do with Taiwan now that we didn't do 5 years ago that's mostly private. And so can you help us think through what might be advantageous to stability, or what might help stability in the cross-strait relationship in terms of public versus private signaling and activity?
Yeah, so again, that's a great question. And so my view on this is that kind of the public high profile stuff, right? Because I'm of the view that I don't really think that the U.S. Commitment to Taiwan is that much in doubt. Like, you know, there's debate about what the U.S. is going to do, but you're right. Like, all U.S. alliances have some ambiguity in them, right? And kind of expected U.S. response is going to kind of hinge on kind of the facts on the ground. It's not like the U.S. kind of went to war with North Korea right after the Yongbyon incident, right? And so there's, you know, the U.S. is going to kind of make decisions based on kind of what happens. And so I don't think that the kind of the overall kind of U.S. commitment to Taiwan is that much in doubt. Okay, and so consequently, I'm kind of skeptical about kind of the value added of kind of high profile kind of public demonstrations of commitment, especially things that do nothing in terms of actually kind of changing the facts on the ground in terms of things like Taiwan's war readiness or kind of balance of power or whatever, right? And so quintessential examples, right, like a high profile speech, right, in the U.S., right, or by a Taiwan president, right, rather than kind of a more low profile meeting with some people on a stopover, right, or the Speaker of the House going to Taiwan, right, which is a little bit different because that wasn't the administration, right, and so I think that China like massively overreacted to that, but so you know, but broadly speaking, these kind of high, you know, or people kind of calling for kind of port of call visits to Taiwan, which would be kind of highly visible, right? Kind of and kind of in your face to China, right? Kind of thing that the U.S. could do, or kind of public meetings at high levels of kind of officiality, right? I don't think a lot is accomplished by that in terms of kind of signaling, but it does put the Chinese government kind of in an awkward position where it looks weak if it doesn't respond strongly. Okay, and so I think it's generally not a good idea to do this sort of thing. I think it's counterproductive, and it encourages kind of the PRC to kind of react in a strong sort of way. And so I'm kind of of the view that the U.S. should be mostly seeking quieter ways to kind of enhance deterrence in the Taiwan Strait.
Okay, well, that's a great segue to one of the audience questions here. It's actually Jim Fearon is on here, and so his question is about Taiwanese will to fight, and whether you think Taiwanese leaders would actually fight if they didn't expect military support from the United States. And secondly, how much do you think Beijing worries about the effect of U.S. policy on DPP's pushing the envelope or push for independence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that there's a view. So starting with kind of the second one, and so obviously I drew heavily from your work, Jim. So I appreciate that. So in terms of kind of pushing like U.S. influence on kind of incentivizing kind of the DPP to push the envelope, yeah, I think that there's definitely kind of a view of this in China, right? That that the U.S. Kind of a tightening of kind of U.S.-Taiwan security relationship in recent years is essentially kind of enabling the DPP to not even just kind of pushing the envelope, but it's making the DPP kind of more confident and kind of resisting kind of any moves toward political talks with the PRC. Right. And so I think that that's obvious, that's absolutely kind of seen as there's a link between those. In terms of kind of Taiwan will to fight, I think it's really hard to say. So my guess is that the polling on this is it's a little bit, ambiguous. My understanding, I've seen a couple of different polls. So there's the national security poll that Emerson Yo does from a couple of years ago. Which kind of suggested that, actually quite a substantial percentage of kind of the population kind of indicated like a willingness to kind of resist in some way, right? Many fighting, or not kind of cooperating. It was kind of an open-ended question. What would you do in the event of a PRC attack? And it was, I think, a little bit kind of surprising from my standpoint. I think it got framed as, oh, not a huge percentage of the population wants to fight. I was actually kind of surprised that was that high in kind of an open-ended hypothetical question. But beyond that, I just kind of think that if we were in a world where the PRC was actually bombing Taiwan and sending troops into Taiwan, right, it's really hard to pull that. If that happened, it would really make people in Taiwan angry. And so I think that there would be considerable resistance in Taiwan. It's just a hunch, but there's not a lot of support for unifying with the PRC. I don't think that Taiwan would just roll over. That's a hunch. It's not based on kind of polling. The polls are kind of ambiguous, but I don't think that polling on this kind of an issue is necessarily that reliable.
Do you think Beijing shares your view on that?
I don't know. Yeah. And I think, and the bigger question is what does kind of Xi Jinping kind of think about stuff? Right. Versus kind of people who really understand Taiwan, and how much of a connect is there between those two things?
Yeah, right. So let me pivot to another audience question, which is, it observes that there's different forms of conflict that are possible in this relationship. So in the model, you've modeled this as basically binary. There's a conflict or there's not. And is there a way to complicate this in a way that's tractable by thinking about a blockade or gray zone activity or a cordon sanitaire or even a fifth column of saboteurs rising up? How would you kind of work with that? And does that change the logic of the model at all?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think it's something that I have to think a lot more about, right? So not like basically, right. And there's a growing interest in this question, right? Because I'm of the view that the PRC really doesn't want to fight a war in the Taiwan Strait. Now, I could be wrong about this, and people certainly disagree with me. I think this is something that the PRC still would look at as kind of a last resort, just because the risks of doing it are potentially catastrophic. The possibility of the U.S. and China fighting a war, right? It's almost kind of too horrible to really contemplate kind of how awful that could get really fast. So I think that it's really important to kind of think about kind of like how the PRC, in the absence of actually using, right? So the shadow of military conflict is always going to be there, and the PRC is not going to kind of, preclude on the kind of the possibility of using force against Taiwan. But what are kind of the tools of kind of coercion that the PRC has, kind of short of actually trying to invade and occupy Taiwan? And I don't think that my model does a really great, and it's this kind of basic model. I don't think it does a really great job of kind of thinking about this. I guess what I would say is that, like, when you kind of think about kind of most kind of forms of coercion that the PRC can kind of impose on Taiwan, short of actually occupying Taiwan, it's really hard to kind of get from kind of coercion. So Beijing can kind of put a lot of pressure on Taiwan, right? But if Taiwan is kind of resolved, right, it's really, really hard to kind of get Taiwan to kind of yield on sovereignty issues. And a lot of kind of these sort of things like, right, the military pressure, right, the frequent flights, right, the intrusions into Taiwan Air Force airspace, right? Like, I actually think that they're probably kind of backfiring to some degree, right, in that they're underscoring the degree to which the PRC is a threat. They're underscoring the degree to which among kind of there's a kind of consensus in Taiwan that it's important to have good relations with the US, right? You see the different presidential campaigns kind of all emphasizing that they'll be able to kind of maintain those close ties, right? So I actually think that a lot of this stuff, potentially actually backfires, right? And that it's really hard for the PRC to kind of solve this kind of underlying sovereignty issue, kind of short of actually using military force. Like, I don't think sanctions are going to do it. A blockade is a possibility, but it will be a mess, right? And it would, needless to say, it would get a lot of negative international publicity, and I'm not sure that it would redound to the kind of the PRC's favor. So I know that's kind of a non-answer to the question, but it's just kind of me thinking on the spot about kind of about some of these issues, and I think that they're hard to model. They're also it's really hard for the kind of the PRC to make progress on this issue, given kind of where Taiwan public opinion in a democracy is on unification. It's really hard for the PRC to kind of make a lot of headway on this, kind of short of actual use of military force, which it views as being very unattractive.
Right. So you've basically just made a case for democracy as kind of a core part of Taiwan's defenses here. It makes it a harder nut to crack for the PRC, so to speak. So a related question to that is from Larry Diamond, and that's about the upcoming presidential and legislative elections in Taiwan and the implications of, on the one hand, another DPP president coming out of this election, perhaps, not necessarily, but perhaps with a majority in the legislature of the DPP as well, versus, say, a pan-blue coalition actually winning this election and maybe enjoying also a coalition majority in the legislature, and how you think those might affect the relationship across the strait.
Yeah, so I mean, that's like, as you know, right, like it's very much in the air, up in the air, right? And obviously I should kind of defer here to Karis when kind of thinking about where the election, and I'm actually kind of curious to hear your views on kind of the likelihood of pan-blue cooperation. But yeah, so there's a big wild card right now, right? Is whether Hoyoi and Ko-Wen-je are going to be able to kind of forge an alliance, and if they do, right, like, the polls kind of suggest that they've got a good chance of potentially winning the election. All right, if they figure out a way to kind of decide kind of who to put on the top of the ticket, and they can kind of agree to that, and how they're going to deal with kind of which party gets what seats in the legislature. So it's still up in the air, right? Absent cooperation, right, Lai is probably going to win and DPP is going to stay in power, although I guess the LY elections are a little bit more up in the air in that regard. So what does it mean? I mean, I think that for a long time, Beijing's basically been expecting Lai to win. Like even a year ago, I talked to some well-known analysts of Taiwan who were quite pessimistic about kind of the KMT's kind of chances in the 2024 election, right? And so I think it's basically what the PRC would be kind of expecting as kind of an outcome in the election is kind of the DPP staying in power. I don't think that Lai is going to do anything dramatic, different from what kind of Tsai has been doing, and I think he's been very careful to kind of signal that he's not going to do anything, even though he has, Beijing's not going to trust him at all, right? And they're probably going to trust him less, right? They don't trust Tsai at all, and they're going to trust Lai even less, given kind of his past statements and kind of commitment to Taiwan independence. But he's kind of indicating, I think, pretty credibly that he's not going to do anything dramatic. And he signaled this, right? Like, so when he went to Paraguay a couple months ago for a presidential inauguration, right? He stopped over in the U.S., right? And Beijing kind of complained, but it was very low key. And he didn't really emphasize it as much as he emphasized his trip to Paraguay, right? And so I think he's done a pretty good job of kind of signaling and convincing, people in Washington and domestically, and kind of reassuring the domestic public that he's not going to do anything too dramatic. And so I see mostly kind of where trends have been going the last few years. They're probably going to continue if Lai is in power. And part of kind of Beijing's, like how Beijing kind of interprets the election is probably going to depend on kind of what it kind of concludes are kind of the reasons for Lai's win. Is it because the Pan Blue side is like pathetic and they split? And if they could just get their act together, then there's hope, right? And so let's just kind of be patient, and maybe 2028 is going to turn out better. And we'll just wait for Lai to become inevitably unpopular, because at that point you'll have 12 years of DPP governance, and parties start to become pretty unpopular after a while when they're in office. Or are they going to become, or are they going to be like, oh, the KMT is hopeless, right? Like they, even now, right? Like Tsai isn't that popular, right? The Pan Greens don't get a lot of support, and they still blow it, right? And can't figure out a way to accommodate Ko and Ja and win this thing, right? So I think part of kind of how they, like, their response and the kind of the degree to which they're willing to be patient is going to hinge on kind of the interpretation of kind of the long-term fortunes of the KMT in the aftermath of an election. Mm-hmm. If the Pan Blue wins, right, it gets kind of interesting. I think there'll be obviously there'll be expectations, right, in Beijing about a more accommodating policy, right, and efforts to kind of restart dialogue. I would assume that the PRC would be kind of somewhat accommodating of this, and recognizing that, like a Pan Blue coalition isn't going to be able to just kind of, sell out Taiwan, right, and accept unification, right? There's constraints, and it's going to be a close election no matter what, right? And I think there'll be some appreciation of this, right? But I do kind of wonder over time if, right, so there was clearly growing frustration in Beijing during the Ma Ying-jeou administration that Ma was not willing to kind of move into a discussion of political issues, that he wanted to kind of keep it focused on kind of pragmatic economic type issues. So I do think that that Beijing's likely to become kind of frustrated, because I don't think that the KMT or if Ke is at the top of the ticket and wins, I don't think that they're going to just kind of move dramatically in Beijing's kind of direction. And so that's kind of question, right? Like that's in a way is kind of a scarier type scenario, in that it may cause kind of even more pessimism in Beijing, right? Like if even the Pan Blues come into power and even they can't be accommodating, that could be quite worrisome. Yeah. Right. And so I think that the Pan Blues winning would be immediately stabilizing. Things would get better, right? But there would, there's kind of underlying that is kind of the potential that things could kind of get more off the rails in a couple of years down the road.
Yeah. Okay. Another question tangentially related to that is the growth of the semiconductor industry into this powerhouse in Taiwan, and a really kind of strategic industry there. And how might that have changed the calculus in Beijing? Is their expected utility of a conflict gone up, or has it gone down as a result of the emergence of TSMC as this powerhouse?
So my take on this, and again, like, as a political scientist who, right, like barely understands how semiconductors work, right? Like, take it whatever.
Right there with you,
with a grain of salt, right?
Right.
My take on this is that it's the latter, right? So that the TSMC is something that its emergence into kind of this powerhouse makes conflict much, much more costly for Beijing, right? And so sometimes you hear this argument that, oh, well, it means that the prize has gone up in value, right? And there's more to be gained by occupying Taiwan because of this prize. But I don't think that that's how semiconductor manufacturing works, right? I think that it's mostly things like human capital and networks that kind of make this successful, and kind of close relationship with firms in like Silicon Valley and so forth. Right. And I think all of that kind of gets shattered in addition to probably the physical plants being blown up, right, in the event of a kind of a worse scenario. So I think TSMC like loses value, right, and so the A gets crushed, and the ripple effects on the global economy are massive, including the effects on the Chinese economy.
Right. Okay. So we shouldn't view TSMC or chips as the new oil and the thing that everybody's going to be fighting for.
Yeah, I don't think it's like oil at all.
Yeah. Final question, because we're just about at time here. So I'm sitting in the Bay Area right now. APEC is about to start here. Xi and Biden are about to meet tomorrow in San Francisco. What are your expectations for that meeting, and are they likely to have a positive or negative impact on the prospects for conflict across the strait?
Yeah, so I don't have super high expectations for the meeting. Like I don't think that either leader has super high expectations, but I think it's good that they're meeting. So that alone is like, is better than where we've been for the, basically since the balloon incident.
Yeah.
So I view it as something that at least like, potentially opens the door to kind of more diplomacy. And we've seen more diplomacy kind of recently. And I view that as a good thing when kind of thinking about the prospects for conflict in the Taiwan Strait, because it gives both sides more of a stake in maintaining kind of a stable relationship. But that said, I don't think that any huge breakthroughs are going to be reached. And I don't think that either, Biden can't appear weak, right, in the current domestic political environment in the US. So he's not going to make any major kind of concessions or try to kind of appear that he's kind of appeasing Xi at all. She's not going to want to like look like he's kind of giving anything to Biden. And so my expectations are pretty low.
Great. Well, we're just about at time, so I do want to put in one more plug for Scott's book. It's called War and Peace in the Taiwan Strait with Columbia University Press. If you're at all interested in this area or this topic, it is a really excellent, careful, nuanced analysis of the cross-strait balance of power and where it's headed in the future. I'd also like to just give a shout out very quickly to our events team for helping support this event, to Janet Smith, to Sharon Natuna, to Hillary Weisfeld, and especially to Amy Alonso for her help in arranging all of this. Once again, I'm Karis Templeman. I'm a research fellow here at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And this speaker series event is a product of the Project on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region. We've been speaking with Scott Kastner of the University of Maryland. Thanks again for joining us, Scott. It's great to have you on, and I hope we can bring you out in person, not just in the virtual realm, but in the real realm here soon. So thanks again, and best wishes to everyone out there. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Karis.
My pleasure.